Okay. First off, thanks everyone for joining us this evening for our webinar on planning for rising 9th and 10th graders. I'm Bob Carlton with College Matchpoint. Lisa Bain Carlton and I manage College Matchpoint, and we're excited to bring to you this webinar to help parents think about the choices in front of you in terms of planning with your 9th and 10th, rising 9th and 10th graders. A couple of logistical issues. We are using the Zoom meeting platform. You'll notice on the bottom bar that you're able to chat any questions. Please feel free to over the course of the webinar. Towards the end, I'll try to make sure we have plenty of time to handle questions. At the end of the webinar, I will chat you a link for the presentation. And the presentation will be available archived online on YouTube by tomorrow morning. So with that as an intro, let's dive into this evening's presentation. So what you can see here is our topic for the evening, planning for rising 9th and 10th graders. And the expectation is that all of you are parents of some 9th and 10th graders, and congratulations. For many of you, this might be your second or third child. For some of you, it may be your first child who's going through this crazy jungle gym that is high school engagement, and then ultimately college planning and college applications. As we mentioned in terms of tonight's session, we're focusing on how to help make sure your student does the right thing and that they don't get in front of themselves, they don't get ahead of themselves, they don't get in a place where they spend so much time getting stressed. Now, it's difficult for parents that we work with to oftentimes say, who is this young person? I've seen them through elementary school and middle school, and yet now they seem like a completely different person. And what we always say to parents is that that is, frankly, the very definition of being a 9th and 10th grader. Now, we share with many of our parents excerpts of this wonderful book from Dr. Dan Siegel. Dr. Siegel is at UCLA and is a neuroscientist. And he has a book called Brainstorm that does a wonderful job of helping manage expectations about developmentally where are 9th and 10th graders, where are 14 to 16-year-olds, and what's going on as they grow and develop. Now, the first thing that we always say to parents is that to some extent, you're looking at a student who is going through one of the most awkward growth spurts possible, even more so than when you have a young baby and they're going through that growth spurt. I think parents of 13 to 16-year-olds are familiar with them beginning to get a sense of social behavior and of abstract thought. And I think we're all used to 13 to 16-year-olds being eager to experiment. Later in this webinar, we'll try to look at using that experiment mindset as an advantage, as something to lean into, as opposed to something to push against. One comment, that experimentation can oftentimes make parents feel like guinea pigs, that we're being experimented upon. And that's a natural frustration and tension that happens developmentally when students get to this point. The last thing, and we certainly see this as a student either enters into high school or moves into her sophomore year of high school, that sometimes their decision-making can be overly influenced by emotions. That decision-making can be as simple as where do I want to get a dinner tonight, or it can be as complex as what classes do I want to take next year. Now, the second item that Dr. Siegel talks about is how they interact behaviorally. And I think most parents of 9th or 10th graders are used to a spike in social anxiety. And that social anxiety can also oftentimes be seen from the eyes of another. Part of that is just the way the brain is developing. A student is aware of sort of abstract reasoning, of the ability to even think about other human beings around them, which may not have literally ever crossed their minds before they entered their freshman or sophomore year of high school. And then the second thing, and this isn't always the case in terms of social anxiety and abstract reasoning, is that some students find themselves ruminating about what others think about them. Now, social media certainly hasn't helped this. It provides them an entire instantly accessible environment to ruminate, to be liked, to be followed. But this is a natural function of brain chemistry that has existed far before Zuckerberg started Facebook. What they're ultimately looking for, and this is oftentimes the case for both introverts and for extroverts, is they're looking for peer approval. They're looking for the individuals that surround them, either at school, in their own personal life, or in the organizations that they're a part of, and that their brains are actually hardwired to seek reward. And that reward can come in great units, like their own progress and their own accomplishments. And I think most parents of 13 to 16-year-olds are aware that sometimes that desire, that hardwiring to seek rewards can oftentimes be a student's greatest enemy. So with that as context, and we'd urge you, if you're interested, to buy a copy of Dr. Siegel's book. It's incredibly helpful, even if you're a parent of your second or third teenager who's going through this process. Now, we work with countless 9th and 10th and 11th and 12th graders. And when we ask them to talk about their lives, what makes up their lives, what are the meaningful parts of their lives, what we oftentimes hear them do is talk about their lives organized around experiences, organized around not, I was in this club, I was a member of this church, I grew up in scouting, though that is increasingly so meaningful for so many students. But we hear them talk about experiences as the key milestones for their lives. And those experiences can be thought of in a pretty easy mnemonic, and that is epic. That those experiences are elevated in some way. It's different from the normal day-to-day that a student goes through. And this is certainly the case when an individual enters high school. They have that huge football game, that music festival, that dance performance that really feels elevated and feels like the single most important thing they've ever been involved in. I think of a student that I was talking to at a local high school here in Austin. Her marching band had gone to the Band of America performance, and she talked about it as literally the pinnacle of her 14 years on earth. And she talked with pride based on accomplishment, not just of her own accomplishment, but of the shared accomplishment of her band. Now, those experiences, one of the things that's unique for a freshman or sophomore in high school that may not have existed when they were in 6th or 7th grade, is that they're able to think abstract and to have some insight into who they are and who their collective group is, that insight, that self-reflection. Unfortunately, sometimes it can lend itself to rumination, but more typically, it leads itself to a developing sense of identity and to a greater sense of the affiliation of the groups they're a part of. And then finally, and I think we probably all see this as parents ourselves, we live in a connected world. That connection is oftentimes not just institutional, but technology enabled. And one of the things we hear from students over and over again is about their life experiences only being meaningful if they can be shared in pictures, typically on Instagram. It's not unusual for a student to take out their phone and show us an experience that's meaningful to them based on a photograph or a post on Instagram. Again, this has some implications in terms of social reward. This has some implications in terms of network, but we literally have had students say, an experience doesn't have meaning if I can't post a picture of it, and I often post a picture of it while I'm experiencing it. So given that context, let's talk a little bit about what our role is as a parent. This is a quote from a wonderful book that some of y'all may be familiar with called How to Raise an Adult. And the author talks about our task as it relates to these wonderful young people that we're parenting. And that is their task developmentally is to start separating from their family, to develop and establish a sense of autonomy and authority. College Matchpoint really believes in this. We think that students need to be empowered in terms of how they engage in high school, ultimately how they plan for college, and how they would apply to college, because we feel like it drives their engagement in a satisfying, creative experience of high school, and it prepares them to thrive in college. But by no means does that mean that a teen no longer needs their parents. Even if, frankly, they yell that across the room or upstairs to you over and over again. Instead, what they oftentimes are looking to parents for, and they rarely are going to be able to articulate this with words, is to figure out what their new coping strategies are. The things that worked for them when they were at middle school, the things that worked for them at summer camp, may no longer work for them when they're at a huge high school or a smaller college prep school, where the environment and the social environment may be radically different, even if they're friends that they've had all their lives, or especially if it's a brand new high school that they're new to and they're navigating. So if that's our role as a parent, then I think the question for this, and I think why many of you joined this evening's webinar, is where should your teen focus? And we believe profoundly that students in their 9th and 10th grade should focus on being engaged. And that engagement isn't just our belief, it's borne out by some research that the Gallup organization did, where they looked longitudinally at students who were deeply engaged in high school and how that translated to their grades and to their performance in school, as well as their belief about their future. Now, we believe this is important because students need to have a spectacular experience of high school, and that's not one size fits all. That is really an expression of that student individually. But we feel like both to engage in high school and ultimately to plan and apply for college, it really all begins with the student's focus and encourage rising 9th and 10th graders to stay laser focused on engagement, despite the many distractions that are in front of them. Now, a contrast to that sense of engagement is this mantra that we hear so often, and that is find your passion. We heard a student who came into us a couple of months ago, who is a freshman. She felt like a failure because she felt like constantly she was being expected to find her passion. She compared herself to some of her friends who she felt like had already found their passion. And what we shared with her, not in as direct a language as this, but what we shared with her is the problem with putting pressure on a student to find their passion is that it is really astonishingly bad advice. There's a great TED Talk by Cal Newport who really expands on this and says, for all adults, but particularly for young adults as they're transitioning into new settings, putting the pressure to find their passion is likely not the right focus. And particularly as parents, the more we place our focus, our view on this, the more it may make a student feel like, I just don't know my passion yet, and I must feel less than. So where should we start? If it's not passion, where should a student start? And as a parent, what are the kind of questions that you might spark a conversation around? Now, surprisingly, we always encourage 9th or 10th graders when we start working with them to start with what interests them right now. What has sparked their interest in the last day, the last week, and the last month? Now, oftentimes when they work with someone like us or when they talk to a parent, they can feel like this needs to be a big deal. This needs to somehow mean that I'm a grown-up, or it somehow means an accomplishment. And that interest as a 13, 14, or 15-year-old can span the universe. Students can become interested and then lay aside that interest on almost a minute-by-minute standpoint. But what we often also do with students is to ask them to think about how they spend their time pursuing their interests. Now, I'll comment here that parents of young men typically say, well, of course, they're pursuing their interest in video games. And parents of young women, not to oversimplify it, oftentimes say they're pursuing their interest in Snapchat or Instagram. And what we say to parents is, you know, honestly, while it's tempting to articulate that a use of technology is bad, what we found increasingly is what's below that time investment. It might be connection because the student really enjoys playing video games and online with their friends in a guild setting. It might be that a student loves traveling, or they love food, or they love fashion. And so posting on Instagram is a great way to share that interest and a great way to connect with others. And then we oftentimes encourage students to think about how to start with their current interests and then to explore, to build on those interests. Now, a note of caution here. We constantly say to students, this is not about a recipe. This is not about you doing things because, quote unquote, it looks good on your college application. You are uniquely gifted with a set of interests and aptitudes, and we encourage students to follow those. Now, what's a trail map? What should help guide your rising 9th or 10th graders as they navigate this jungle gym that is high school engagement and ultimately college planning and college applications? We really feel like there are three aspects of that trail map. One, a student's set of aptitudes. Depending on your own context or background, you may think of these as their gifts. It's how they came into the world. It's how they problem solve. Now, skills are really different from aptitudes. Skills can be developed. They're a sense of talents. Some students have skills that match to their aptitudes. Some students have skills that they've honed over years, almost decades, to really become a master at a certain activity or a certain talent. And one thing that excites us in working with 9th and 10th graders is the entire tapestry of skills that students have developed of their own motivation, not because it's required in a classroom, not even because their friends are interested in that skill, but because they're simply fascinated and enthralled. You probably have seen your own student watch countless hours of YouTube videos, go online in terms of trying to figure out how other people develop these skills. And it really is an extraordinary opportunity at this moment for students to share their own skills development with other students. And honestly, if you look at high school is not simply the hours spent in a classroom or the lunchroom, the knowledge gained by a student in those settings, but almost more important, the skills that your student, both hard skills and soft skills, that they develop in high school and that they'll walk through to college carrying with them. And then finally, one of the things that we spend the most amount of time with, particularly for rising 9th graders, is their motivation. What moves them to action? Are they artistic and they really look at applying their aptitudes and skills to settings that are really expressive and creative? Are they enterprising? They love to compete. They want to start that business. They want to create that app. Or honestly, are they realistic? They love hands-on. They love nothing more than tinkering or creating. They're going to spend more time at the thinkery than they ever would spend in their own room. We encourage parents, however they find a conversation setting that's meaningful, to consider this as a trail map. And we dedicate a large portion of our time with 9th and 10th graders to really helping them gain language and a sense of awareness around these aptitudes, skills, and motivations. And the good news is there are countless tools out there to utilize. Some of you who have older kids that we've worked with are aware that we use a tool called U-Science. It's a fabulous tool. There's another tool, battery of assessments, called Johnson O'Connor. These are not genetic testing that will magically tell you precisely what aptitudes, skills, and motivations your student has. but rather a conversation partner to really help your student begin to reflect, identify, and gain confidence in what makes them distinctive. Now, if that's our trail map, then how do we organize and focus that trail map? So at College Matchpoint, we've developed a model, Lisa and I, that we call I-4. It's a simple model. At the center of that are aptitudes, skills, and motivations. It starts with that. That needs to be the compass, if you will, for the student's engagement. And that I-4 model is really a simple mnemonic, and that is interest. As I said, students have to start with interest. They can't be imposed on them. They can't be a resume or a GPS setting that tells them exactly how to show up at College Station or Princeton Junction. The second I is involvement, where they're engaged, where they find themselves spending meaningful amount of time. When they end up applying to college, most colleges will ask them, how many hours a week and weeks a month have you been involved in this activity? And very different from when many parents applied to college, what schools aren't necessarily looking for are just what are called well-rounded students. Students that are involved in 500 activities for 15 minutes a month. But instead, students who have shown deep involvement and have translated that involvement to both initiative and impact. Initiative, where they've been able to step into that involvement, to create new programs, to take initiative during the school year or in the summer. And then finally, impact, that sense of legacy, what the student leaves behind when they leave that high school or that community that they're a part of. Now, that I-4 model is something that we come back to over and over again. We have an entire guide that we've developed, and we feel like this is important work, particularly for a rising 9th and 10th grader, to come back to and assess the time they're spending and how energized they are. Now, we talk about engagement. Many of you asked in the preliminary information, could you tell me what my students should be doing in the classroom as a rising 9th and 10th grader? And the answer is they should be looking for opportunities to be fully engaged in the classroom based on their aptitudes, skills, and motivation. Now, probably every parent who interacts with your student will tell them they need to take schoolwork seriously and they need to work to get the best grades they can. Now, if you think about that mathematically, the question should be, is the student able to take the most challenging courses available to her each year in a setting that she can excel academically? Now, all of us can get a calculator out and figure out, is a C in an AP or pre-AP course worth more than an A at a grade level course? And the simple, honest answer is that in weighted GPAs, it typically means that that higher grade in a grade level course can be stronger. That's not important per se. What's important per se is to make sure that a student is making choices that prepares them for challenging courses throughout their high school experience, but they're also choosing classes where they can excel and gain confidence academically. Now, the last thing, at many high schools here in Austin and across the country, there are huge opportunities for initiative and impact, even as 9th graders. If you're in a public high school in the state of Texas, you have to choose what's called an endorsement. And we include in this information an entire link on endorsement. Now, we want to be clear, you're not presetting your student to only one track. You're defining instead the kind of classes that they might have an opportunity to take initiative and to show impact in. Those run the gamut, anywhere between a student whose endorsement is pre-med or medical areas to a student who really wants to get deeper experience in coding. It might be a student who found that she loved her coding course during her summer camp, and she wants to spend a meaningful amount of her electives academically in high school, getting even more experience in coding so that ultimately she can build a portfolio of the coding projects that she's developed. Now, this is what engagement looks like in the classroom. The simple question is if it's that easy to answer what does engagement look like, then what does engagement not look like? And as I said before, engagement doesn't look like taking highly advanced courses if they're well above your teenager's academic ability. It has two impacts. Very simply, it impacts their transcript in a way that may not reflect their intellectual or aptitudes or skills. Most importantly, it creates a sense on the student standpoint that they failed, that they weren't able to keep up. And the good thing is at most high schools in the first couple of weeks of a class, there's oftentimes an ability to change class levels. That might be a nice initial learning opportunity, but we really encourage families to have honest, open conversations about that important matching consideration of the student's academic capabilities, the relative rigor of the course, and then how to make class choices that both set them up for short-term success in a semester or a year, and then also sets themselves up as an example in engineering to be able to take calculus either in the junior or senior year. Now, for many parents, we encourage them to employ what Carol DeWitt calls a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. We encourage parents not to say, your GPA in your freshman year needs to be X, or you won't get into UT or Stanford or Duke, but instead to embrace that growth mindset. Now, what does that mean? Carol DeWitt is a professor of psychology at Stanford. As I mentioned before, she has a fabulous set of TED Talks, and this year she'll be a keynote at the South by Southwest EDU conference. And she talks about really embracing the idea that individuals believe that their most basic abilities are developed through dedication and hard work. That brains and talents are just the starting point, they're not the end point. And instead, she encourages people to embrace what she calls a growth mindset. That she looks at, for instance, encouraging a student to expect that when they fail, and they oftentimes will academically, to look at that opportunity for growth, not as an indication of the limit of their abilities or as a fixed grade. We also encourage students, and we see this increasingly, to really weigh the pros and cons of feedback. Some students oftentimes feel like, hey, if I get feedback, it's really personal, I give up. And we feel like, look, students don't come out of the womb with that mindset. It's important for that feedback to be constructive, and it's important to that feedback to help them gain a sense of their aptitudes, their attitude, and what new things they ought to try. Now, the final thing that we make a note here is this comment about inspired by the success of others. To be perfectly frank, in some high schools across this country, college admissions can be the most competitive sport on campus. And it can feel like you live in a zero-sum world. This can be the case the day a student starts middle school, or at some super competitive high school, certainly during their freshman year of high school. We urge families to make a conscious choice not to buy into that fixed mindset, that my student is a failure if he doesn't get into Stanford, my student is a failure if she doesn't get into Georgia Tech, but instead to help them embrace and to help model for them this idea of a growth mindset. This idea that they have opportunities and that their own personal efforts can help them drive towards progress and ultimately success. But that success isn't showing up in College Station or Berkeley. It isn't unpacking at a school in Cambridge, but instead it's an ongoing aspect of thriving in high school, college, and in their career. So if a growth mindset is conceptually what we mean, then we oftentimes point out to students there's a great example of this growth mindset in 2 years ago award-nominated film Lady Bird. The student is meeting with her college counselor. In this case, it's Sister Sarah. And Lady Bird says, what I'd really like to be is on the Math Olympiad. And Sister Sarah, as so many adults would say to her, math is something you're not terribly strong at. And Lady Bird says, that we know of, and then with a long dramatic pause says, yet. Carol Dweck oftentimes says that yet is the most important difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. So if we talk a little bit about a growth mindset, then many parents ask, what does a growth mindset look like if I have a rising 9th or 10th grader who learns differently? There's some simple advice that Lisa Bain Carlton shares with parents. We also have an entire YouTube on this. And it starts with a simple statement. 9th and 10th graders should use their accommodations. They should use it, or frankly lose it, in terms of an accommodation during their high school years, including standardized testing. Now, we oftentimes hear from students who say, well, I used that in middle school, but now I'm in high school. I don't want to look like I can't keep up. I myself wear glasses, and I oftentimes point out to the student, if I take my glasses off, I'm unfairly giving myself a disadvantage because I can't read even the text on this screen. If I need glasses, then frankly, I should use them, not because I'm less than, but because that allows me to succeed at the level of my capabilities and aptitudes. So again, if a student has testing and accommodations, then we encourage students who learn differently to use those accommodations from their first day of high school on. We also encourage students, and Lisa speaks about this in really powerful ways, to begin to develop their own experience of self-advocacy. Many parents of students who learn differently oftentimes find themselves being their students' advocate, certainly in elementary and oftentimes middle school. And we really encourage parents to begin to focus their students on self-advocacy. And then finally, many parents of students who learn differently have found pre-college programs during the summer to sometimes lessen students' anxiety at the prospect of transitioning to college. Now, what does engaging look like outside the classroom? A couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to. Sometimes students cannot be willing to pay their dues. They think, I'm in high school, I'm fabulous, and I absolutely should be able to be president of this club in October of my freshman year. We oftentimes see also that students sometimes struggle with asking questions. They feel like they're going to look stupid. They really literally say, I don't want to ask directions, either on campus or how to do things. And we think foundational to engaging outside of the classroom is for the student to be able to get involved in activities that match their aptitudes and motivators, and for them to gain confidence and comfort in asking questions and in taking their responsibilities. Now, we believe that in terms of 9th and 10th grade, as I mentioned before, in terms of brain chemistry, it's a time that students are drawn towards an experimentation mindset. This is a simple graphic of the scientific method. You start with a hypothesis. I think I would like to learn how to knit. You experiment with knitting. You might go online and look at YouTube videos. You might ask a friend, but you take experimentation seriously. And I think we've all seen experiments in knitting. What was so exciting for us is to see a young man in the 10th grade who was a gifted software developer, but said, honestly, after looking at a computer terminal for 10 hours, I need something to keep my hands busy and I need to distract myself. He had a hypothesis that his beloved aunt who knitted really had this great approach to mindfulness. He taught himself on YouTube how to knit, and he now makes mittens for friends of his that are also coders. He both gained that knowledge, but he also was able to use that to connect with others. And as you can well imagine, he has an Instagram that posts pictures of friends of his wearing those gloves. Now, we at College Matchpoint really believe that experiments for 9th and 10th graders need a little scaffolding. We encourage families and students to think of it as a step-by-step process with broad deadlines in terms of when I want to get this done so I'm prepared to do important things. And this is a tool that we've developed in our work with 9th and 10th graders that we call an experiment planner. And we work on this with the student, and then we encourage them and coach them, but ultimately we try to make sure they're empowered to drive their progress on that experiment. Now, as I said before, self-reflection is a crucial part of 9th and 10th graders. Now, it's typical to understand that some students will instantly say, well, I'm not capable of writing an essay or giving a speech about the why of what I did. And so we find that it's crucial to give students tools. This is a simple activity log that we encourage students to do at some point in a semester to reflect where do they feel particularly engaged and where were they particularly energized. Now, that self-reflection is a critical tool once we get to college essays and college resumes, but frankly, it is a foundational skill in a student's ongoing engagement in high school. Now, what does engagement outside of the classroom not look like? The simple answer is, you know, when a student isn't making choices about healthy engagement, when they ask, will this look good on my resume? That's not a naturally occurring phenomenon for 14 and 15-year-olds. It's only this crazy process of college admissions and the competitive nature of high schools where a student will say, I'm going to do this because it looks good on my resume. I worked with a freshman here in the Austin area. She goes to a very competitive high school. She had identified that she wanted to be a doctor like her mom and dad and their parents had been. She came in excitedly one spring day and said, you're going to be so proud of me. A friend of mine and I started a club. And I said, oh, that's great. What is the club? And she said, it's a club for everything that looks good on your resume. And I said to her, that's spectacular. Just so you know, people will go once because they're not going to be involved in something that isn't sustainable in terms of their own interest. And they're really not going to feel like that club gives them an opportunity to have an impact. So again, a great litmus test is to think, how many times do we discuss as a family, you should do this because it'll look good on your resume? And as a parent, if you find yourself doing that too much, really think to yourself, is that something that really profoundly is going to help my student be engaged? Now, many of you in the notes before this session ask about, what about summer? Increasingly, high school students have found summer to be a fabulous opportunity to spend time learning new skills, diving deeper into area of interest. We are so overwhelmed by our work with students around summer that we've developed an entire guide to summer planning. And in January, February, and March of the spring, it's typical for families to spend at least a little time planning not just camps and travel, but also opportunities for summer for students to be engaged, either in formal pre-college programs or more informal immersive programs that might be more typically tied to a student's potential college major or career. We want to make two notes. One, a student should be doing this as an outgrowth of their interests, their skills, their assessment, their motivation. And two, there is no recipe here. A competitive college or university will not look at a student's resume and say, I need to do a keyword search for whether or not they did Duke Tip. I needed to do a keyword search for whether or not they were involved in this program or that program. College admissions directors have frankly probably read about every possible summer program known to the universe. They're specifically interested in why the student chose it and what they accomplished, rather than simply saying, oh, a very competitive college name is on that summer program. this must show a high level of pedigree for the student. Now, this could be an entirely separate webinar, so I encourage you as a follow-up to either access our summer guide or let me know if you'd like it. We'd be more than happy to share it with you. A couple of last items before I wrap up and tackle any questions folks have. Some of these are items that we've already covered in terms of myths and facts. Extracurricular and academics overlapping is something I really, really want to leave you with. That a student oftentimes has the ability to connect what they're passionately engaged in within school to an extracurricular activity. We had an individual who was doing their capstone activity in scouting. They took their own personal fascination with the extinction of a certain set of animals to do that for their capstone class, both in the class and in scouting, and then turn that into a curriculum that was used at local elementary schools. It was a great example of overlapping academics and extracurricular. Now, you've been wonderful to sit on this webinar for a nice 40 minutes. Where to next? Where does this journey take you? We encourage you to embrace what many folks call a design thinking mindset, to really help your student focus on a curious brain that looks at opportunities with a growth mindset, to try stuff, to experiment. As a parent, to become comfortable with reframing, and ultimately to get your student to be comfortable with reframing. And then most importantly, and we can't emphasize this enough, to make sure they get comfortable in asking for help. It is, in fact, one of the most important distinguishing factors between students who are able to engage in high school and students who feel like they have to go it alone and then ultimately feel like they're a failure because they can't figure it out themselves. Now, as a wrap up, we'd love to have you let us know how we can help you in any way. In the chat box, if you have questions, please share them. I'm also going to unmute everyone. And so once everyone is unmuted, if you'd like to chime in with any questions that you have, please feel free to. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I'll certainly send each of you a follow-up with the link to the archived webinar to this presentation. But does anyone have any questions they'd like to have me address before we wrap up this evening? No, well, we sure appreciate your time and involvement on this evening's webinar. We hope that it's helped give you a sense of how to help guide your students on planning as rising 9th and 10th graders. And if you feel like as a follow-up, there's anything we can do to help you and your family, please don't hesitate to contact us. Tomorrow morning, I'll be sending you an email with the attachment of this presentation and a link to this video. We really appreciate your engagement this evening, and we hope you have a great rest of the night and a great rest of the week.